All right, so we're diving deep today into leadership
Okay.
and how organizations are structured, all that good stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm really excited to get into these YouTube videos you sent over. They feature General Stanley McChrystal
Right.
talking about his book, Team of Teams.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating look at leadership,
Yeah.
especially, in today's world where things are changing so rapidly.
Yeah, and McChrystal, led the American task force in Iraq against al-Qaeda.
Right.
So he really knows a thing or two about dealing with complexity.
Yeah, he's got some really unique insights into what works and what doesn't in those kinds of situations.
One of the things that really jumped out at me
Yeah.
was his challenge to this idea that we need to be, obsessed with efficiency.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because on the surface, it seems like efficiency should be the goal,
Right.
but he argues that being so focused on efficiency can actually make organizations more fragile,
Yeah.
less able to adapt when things change unexpectedly,
And,
which is happening all the time these days.
all the time, yeah. I mean, who could have predicted that a Tunisian street vendor setting himself on fire would lead to,
Right.
the Arab Spring?
Right.
Entire governments were toppled.
Yeah, it's a classic example of how interconnected and unpredictable the world is today.
Right.
And Agristol's point is that those traditional command and control structures that we're so used to,
Yeah.
they just weren't designed for this kind of world. They were built for stability and predictability,
Right.
which are both kind of in short supply these days.
So what's the alternative?
Well, McChrystal points to the power of teams,
Okay.
but not just any teams. He's talking about a network of interconnected teams, what he calls a team of teams.
Team of teams, yeah.
And he uses this really powerful analogy of the 1978 Portland plane crash
Right.
to illustrate this.
Yeah.
The pilot, he was very skilled,
Yeah.
but he tried to manage everything himself, and the outcome was tragic.
Oh, wow.
Now contrast that with the miracle on the Hudson landing in 2009, where the crew, they worked together seamlessly, sharing information and making decisions as a team.
And everyone survived.
Everyone survived.
Yeah, yeah. That's a pretty stark contrast.
It is, and it highlights the power of teamwork.
So what's the secret sauce that makes those high-performing teams so effective?
Well, McChrystal identifies several key elements.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's the shared purpose.
Right.
But you also need deep trust among team members. Open communication is critical,
Mm-hmm.
and the ability to make decisions quickly without getting bogged down in bureaucracy.
Right. So being agile. But how do you scale that up?
Yeah, that's the question.
Not every organization can function like a small, tight-knit group.
Right, exactly. And that's where the team of teams model comes in.
Okay.
It's about creating a network of interconnected teams,
Mm-hmm.
each with their own expertise,
Okay.
but all working together towards a shared vision.
Got it, yeah.
Think of it like a jazz ensemble. Each musician has their own instrument and style, but they improvise and harmonize together
Okay.
to create something truly amazing.
Right.
And it's that same principle applied to organizations.
So how did McChrystal actually implement this with the task force in Iraq?
Well, it's interesting because initially they struggled.
Yeah.
They were up against al-Qaeda,
Right. A formidable enemy.
which was incredibly agile and adaptable.
Mm-hmm.
And the task force itself was made up of these elite units like Delta Force and SEAL Team 6,
Right. The best of the best.
all used to operating independently.
So it was almost like a collection of all-star teams.
Yeah, it was.
But they weren't playing as one cohesive unit.
Exactly. It was kind of a case of too many cooks in the kitchen.
They were running into problems because information wasn't flowing freely between these different teams.
Right. There's actually this striking anecdote about the intelligence team finding bags and bags of crucial information
Really?
just sitting unopened. This information was gathered during raids, but the teams conducting the raids didn't fully grasp how important that intel was to the bigger picture.
So they were missing critical pieces of the puzzle
Yeah.
because of these silos.
Well, and it was costing them valuable time and opportunities
It's so frustrating.
in the fight against al-Qaeda. And that's when McChrystal realized they needed a radical shift
Yeah.
in how they operated. He needed to break down those information silos
Okay.
and create what he calls shared consciousness.
What exactly does that mean?
So it's more than just making sure everyone has access to the same information.
Right.
It's about creating a common understanding of the situation,
Mm-hmm.
the goals, the challenges, and even understanding the mindset of the enemy.
Okay.
To get everyone on the same page, McChrystal implemented these daily video conferences
Right.
that included Thousands of participants across the entire task force.
Thousands.
Thousands, yeah.
That's a lot of people to get on the same page.
It was crucial for fostering that shared consciousness.
Hmm.
They would share intelligence, discuss challenges,
Right.
celebrate successes. And it wasn't just about top-down communication.
Okay.
He also encouraged horizontal communication, so cross-team collaboration and informal networks.
Right. So breaking down those barriers, have you ever been in a meeting where it felt like everyone had different goals
Oh, yeah.
or incomplete information?
All the time. And that's exactly what McChrystal was trying to avoid.
Right, because it's incredibly inefficient
Yeah.
and can lead to bad decisions.
Absolutely.
So how did he actually change things?
Well, it wasn't just about telling people to communicate more.
Right.
It was about creating the structures and systems to facilitate that communication and collaboration.
Okay.
And just as importantly, it was about giving teams the power to act on that information,
Right.
giving them the autonomy to make decisions in real time without waiting for approval from higher-ups.
So moving away from that traditional command and control structure,
Exactly.
giving more power to the teams on the ground.
And this is where things get really interesting,
Okay.
because this shift in leadership,
Yeah.
this move away from being a chess master
Right.
to what McChrystal calls a gardener, is where his ideas really start to challenge conventional thinking.
Okay, now you've got my attention. What's this gardener analogy all
It's
about?
like this, a gardener doesn't control how a plant grows,
Right.
but they create the conditions for success.
Yeah.
The right soil,
Yeah.
sunlight, water.
So instead of micromanaging every detail, the leader focuses on creating the right organizational culture,
Exactly.
the right ecosystem for teams to flourish.
And McChrystal, he talks about how the most effective American commandos were actually more similar
Interesting.
to the most effective al-Qaeda fighters than they were different.
Really?
Both driven by purpose,
Okay.
commitment, and courage. The key difference was the environment
Okay.
and the path they chose.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
It highlights the importance of understanding, different perspective,
Yeah.
even those we might consider our adversaries.
Right, and that empathy is crucial for building trust,
Yeah.
which is really the foundation of any high-performing team.
Right.
Without trust,
Right.
you get silos, people hoarding information,
Yeah.
and a reluctance to take risks.
Which brings us back to McChrystal's experience in Iraq. How did he actually start implementing this team of teams model
Right.
with those elite units who were so used to operating independently?
Well, he started by being brutally honest.
Okay.
He acknowledged that they were losing the war against al-Qaeda.
Right.
And that the old ways weren't working.
That must have been a tough pill to swallow
Yeah, well,
for those elite units.
it was.
To be told, that they needed to change their ways.
Yeah, but instead of dictating a specific plan,
Okay.
he fostered an environment of experimentation and continuous learning.
So kind of like a we're going to figure this out together
Yeah.
approach.
Yeah, exactly. He basically told his team, we're going to iterate our way to success. It was less about having all the answers
Yeah.
and more about embracing a growth mindset,
Right.
being open to new ideas,
Right.
and willing to learn from failures.
And speaking of failure, that's another crucial aspect of this model.
It is.
Right. That McChrystal recognized that in a fast-moving, complex environment,
Right.
mistakes were inevitable,
Yeah.
but they were also valuable learning opportunities.
Right.
And that's a big shift from the traditional view of leadership, where failure is often seen as a sign of weakness.
Yeah.
You get punished for it.
Exactly.
But McChrystal had to create a culture where people felt safe to fail, to learn, and to adapt.
Yeah. He would say that, we have to create an environment where it's okay to make mistakes
Right.
as long as we learn from them. And actually, he had this incredible 70% success rate
Wow.
in his operations,
That's amazing.
which is amazing.
Yeah.
But it also meant that 30% of the time, things didn't go as planned.
Right.
So he had to make it okay to fail.
So it was about shifting the mindset from
Yeah.
avoid failure at all costs to
Yeah.
fail fast and fail forward.
Right.
Which is a very Silicon Valley kind of mantra these days. But I imagine that takes a lot of courage
It does.
and a very specific kind of leadership to make that a reality.
It does. And one of the key strategies he implemented to facilitate this was the daily video conference
Right.
we talked about earlier, with over 7,000 participants. It was a cornerstone of building shared consciousness.
7,000 people.
Yeah. It's wild to think about.
It's like a small town.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Tuning in every day.
It was amazing.
What exactly were they discussing in those meetings?
So it wasn't about, giving orders or micromanaging.
Right.
It was about creating that common understanding of the situation, like we talked about. They'd share intelligence, discuss challenges,
Right.
celebrate successes. It was about fostering transparency,
Mm-hmm.
breaking down silos, and building trust across the entire task force.
So a radical level of transparency and open communication.
Yeah, it was pretty unprecedented.
And he also encouraged horizontal communication, so like cross-team collaboration.
Right?
And informal networks,
Yeah.
not just top-down directives.
Exactly. He even had members of different teams spend time embedded with other units.
Really?
Like, a SEAL might spend 6 months with an Army U.S. Special Forces team
Wow.
and vice versa.
That's a great way to break down those cultural barriers.
Yeah.
And build, those personal relationships that are so crucial for trust.
Exactly. And another key element of this model
Yeah.
is empowering people to make decisions, what McChrystal called empowered execution.
Empowered execution.
He realized that waiting for approval from higher-ups could be fatal
Oh, yeah.
in a fast-moving environment.
Because in the time it takes to get that approval,
Right.
the situation on the ground might have completely changed.
Exactly.
Hmm.
So he gave teams the authority to make decisions in real time
Wow.
based on the shared consciousness they developed.
Okay.
And the information they had access to, it was about trusting people to do their jobs.
Yeah.
Giving them the tools and the information they needed,
Right.
and then getting out of their way.
So it wasn't about abandoning structure altogether. It was about creating a more fluid, adaptable system. One that combined the stability of a traditional hierarchy
Yeah.
with the agility of a network.
It was the best of both worlds, really.
Right.
And a key aspect of making this work was defining clear decision spaces.
Decision spaces.
Yeah, it's about setting boundaries within which teams have the authority to make decisions
Okay.
without needing approval from higher-ups. Think of it like giving someone the keys to a car,
Right.
but also providing them with a map
Yeah.
and clear directions on where they can and cannot go.
So it's not about giving everyone complete freedom
Right.
to do whatever they want. It's about setting clear parameters
Yeah.
and giving them the autonomy to operate within those boundaries.
Exactly. And the size of that decision space can vary, depending on the experience and expertise of the team. So a more seasoned team might have a wider decision space,
Right.
while a newer team might have a more limited one.
That makes sense, yeah. But how do you ensure that everyone understands those boundaries and doesn't, overstep their authority?
Transparency is key.
Okay.
And this is where that daily video conference comes in again.
Right.
It was a crucial tool for communicating those decision spaces
Okay.
and ensuring that everyone understood who had the authority to make what decisions.
Right.
And it fostered accountability.
Right.
Because when everyone knows who's responsible for what,
Yeah.
it's easier to track progress and identify challenges.
So it's not just about empowering people to make decisions.
Right.
It's about creating a system of transparency and accountability to ensure that those decisions are aligned with the overall goals.
Right. And McChrystal also talks about the importance of cultivating what he calls positive deviants.
Positive deviants.
Yeah.
What are positive deviants?
So these are the individuals who understand the rules and norms of the organization,
Okay.
but they're also willing to challenge them, to experiment, to push the boundaries.
So they're not necessarily like rebels or rule breakers,
Right.
but they're the ones who are always looking for ways to do things better.
Yeah.
Improve the system.
Exactly. They're the innovators, the ones who aren't afraid to question the status quo.
So they often have a unique perspective then
They do.
that can be valuable.
Very valuable, yeah.
But it takes a leader who's comfortable with a bit of, disruption
Right.
and who can create an environment where those dissenting voices are
Yeah.
heard and valued.
Right.
It's about embracing diversity of thought, recognizing that the best ideas
Yeah.
often come from challenging assumptions and looking at things from a different perspective.
Exactly.
But, I can imagine that it can be challenging to manage those positive deviants.
It can be.
Right. They might ruffle some feathers.
Yeah, they can definitely shake things up a bit.
Yeah, and that brings us back to this idea of leading like a gardener.
Right.
It's about creating a fertile ground for those positive deviants to thrive, to experiment, and to contribute their unique perspectives.
Exactly. So it's not about forcing everyone into a neat little box.
Right.
It's about fostering a culture where those differences are celebrated
Okay.
and leveraged for the benefit of the organization.
Yeah. It's fascinating how all these concepts
Right.
connect back to that Gardner analogy.
It really is. It's less about controlling every detail
Yeah.
and more about creating the right conditions for growth,
Right.
innovation, and adaptability.
But there's another crucial element to this Gardner approach that we
Okay.
haven't touched on yet, and that's character.
That's right.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How does character fit into this leadership model?
Yeah. So we've been talking about General Stanley McChrystal's team of teams model,
Right.
exploring how he, created a more agile and adaptable task force in Iraq.
We've talked about shared consciousness,
Right.
empowered execution,
Yeah.
even positive deviance.
Mhm.
But now you're saying that character is a crucial element,
It is, yeah.
especially for leaders.
And it's interesting, because when you think of military leadership,
Right.
you might picture, a tough as nails general barking orders.
Right. Yeah.
But McChrystal argues that the kind of leadership needed for a team of teams
Yeah.
is actually much more nuanced.
So less about command and control
Yeah.
and more about what exactly?
Well, he emphasizes qualities like integrity,
Okay.
humility,
Mm-hmm.
and a genuine commitment
Mm-hmm.
to the mission and the people involved.
Okay.
And it makes sense when you think about it because in a team of teams environment,
Yeah.
where you're empowering people to make decisions,
Right.
trust is absolutely paramount.
Right. Yeah.
And that trust is built on the leader's character.
Right. You can't just tell people to trust you.
Right.
You have to earn it
Exactly.
through your actions. Your consistency, your willingness to be vulnerable, to admit when you're wrong.
And McChrystal actually talks about how one of the biggest challenges he faced in Iraq
Okay.
was overcoming this inherent distrust
Okay.
between different branches of the
You
military,
can imagine.
even within the task force itself.
Right. Because each branch has its own culture,
Right.
its own way of doing things.
Exactly. And oftentimes, its own ego.
Right.
So McChrystal had to work really hard to break down those barriers,
Yeah.
to build bridges between those different worlds.
Mm-hmm.
And he had to lead by example,
Right.
demonstrating the kind of humility and openness
Okay.
he expected from others.
So it's not just about giving inspiring speeches or setting ambitious goals.
No.
It's about embodying those values
Right.
in your everyday interactions.
And this brings us back to that gardener analogy.
Right.
A good gardener doesn't just plant the seeds and walk away.
Yeah.
They nurture the plants.
Yeah.
They create the conditions for growth.
And they need to be patient.
Yes, very patient.
A garden doesn't bloom overnight.
Exactly.
Mm.
Building trust, creating shared consciousness,
Right.
empowering teams.
Yeah.
These are all long-term investments.
It takes time.
And they require a leader who's in it for the long haul,
right.
who's committed to cultivating the right environment,
Mm.
even when it's challenging.
I'm starting to see how all of these, seemingly disparate concepts,
Yeah.
shared consciousness,
Yeah.
empowered execution, character-based leadership,
Mm-hmm.
all weave together to create this really robust and adaptable
Right.
teams model. But how does someone actually put this into practice?
Well, it's not about copying McChrystal's playbook step by step.
Okay.
It's about understanding those underlying principles
Right.
and adapting them to your own specific context.
So taking those core ideas like transparency,
Yeah.
trust, empowerment, and
Right.
figuring out how they apply to your team,
Right.
your organization, your industry.
And remembering that this is an ongoing process,
Yeah.
not a one-time fix.
Right.
It's about constantly assessing, adapting, and evolving your approach as the world around you changes.
So it sounds like leading in a team of teams environment
Yeah.
is as much about personal growth as it is about organizational change.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It really is about cultivating those qualities of character
Right.
that allow you to lead with humility, empathy, and integrity.
And a lot of patience, it sounds like.
Oh, definitely. Lots of patience.
Well, this has been a really insightful deep dive.
Glad you enjoyed it.
You've given me a lot to think about,
Good.
not just in terms of leadership,
Yeah.
but also in how I approach, teamwork and collaboration in all aspects of my life.
I think that's one of the most valuable things about McChrystal's work.
Yeah.
It's not just applicable to the military or even to business.
Right.
These principles can be applied to any team or organization that's facing complexity and uncertainty. And if you really want to delve deeper into these concepts, I highly recommend checking out McChrystal's books, Team of Teams and One Mission. They're incredible resources.
Awesome. I'll definitely check those out. Well, thanks for taking us on this journey.
My pleasure.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you. And to you listening,
Yeah,
thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it as thought-provoking as we did.
absolutely.
Until next time, keep learning,
Keep growing.
keep growing, and keep connecting.